The sun was sinking behind the jagged cliffs of Red Canyon, painting the sky with shades of fire and gold. A lone rider moved slowly across the dusty trail, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of red sand. His name was Jake Lawson, a cowboy known across the frontier for his sharp aim and quiet courage. Jake pulled the brim of his worn hat lower as the wind carried the distant sound of thunder. It wasn't a storm, though. In the Wild West, thunder often meant gunfire. He stopped his horse near a rocky ridge and looked down toward the small town of Dusty Creek. The town looked peaceful from a distance. Wooden buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, and a few wagons parked near the general store. But Jake knew better. 3 days earlier, a gang known as the Black Vipers had ridden into Dusty Creek. Led by the ruthless outlaw Victor Kane, the gang had robbed the bank and taken control of the town. The sheriff had been locked in his own jail, and the townsfolk were too frightened to fight back. Jake wasn't a sheriff or a lawman, but he had a reason to be here. Victor Kane had once been his friend. Years ago, Jake and Victor had ridden together as cattle drivers. They had faced storms, rustlers, and hungry wolves side by side. But greed had changed Victor. He turned to robbery and violence, building a gang that left fear wherever they rode. Jake had tried to stop him once before. He failed. Now he had come to finish what he started. He rode slowly into town as lanterns flickered to life outside the saloon. A few townspeople peeked from behind curtains, their eyes filled with hope and worry. Jake tied his horse to a wooden post and stepped onto the creaking boardwalk. Inside the saloon, laughter and shouting echoed loudly. The Black Vipers were celebrating. Jake pushed the swinging doors open. The music stopped instantly. Every outlaw turned toward him. Victor Kane leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, Victor said, his voice calm but dangerous. If it isn't Jake Lawson. Jake's hand rested near his revolver. Evening, Victor, he replied quietly. For a moment, the room was silent except for the crackling of the lanterns. Victor stood up slowly. I was wondering when you'd come, he said. Jake looked around at the armed outlaws. I didn't come to talk, Jake said. Victor laughed. Good, he replied. Neither did we. The saloon was thick with tension. The Black Vipers slowly reached for their guns, their eyes locked on Jake Lawson. The air felt heavy, as if even the lantern flames were afraid to move. Jake stood perfectly still. Years of life on the frontier had taught him one thing. The man who moved first was often the man who died first. Victor Kane stepped forward, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. You're outnumbered, Jake, he said calmly. Always were too stubborn to see the odds. Jake glanced around the room. There were 8 men in the gang tonight, 8 guns. But Jake Lawson had survived worse. I'm not here for them, Jake said quietly. His eyes stayed fixed on Victor. I'm here for you. A murmur passed through the gang. Victor's smile faded slightly. He waved his hand at the men behind him. Relax, boys, he said. Jake and I got history. The outlaws stepped back, though their hands stayed close to their revolvers. Victor poured himself a drink and leaned against the bar. Remember the Colorado Trail? Victor asked. Snow up to the horse's knees. Wolves following us for miles. Jake nodded once. We survived because we trusted each other, Victor continued. That was before you started robbing banks, Jake replied. Victor's eyes hardened. You call it robbery, he said. I call it taking what the world owes us. Jake shook his head slowly. The world doesn't owe you anything. Victor suddenly threw the glass against the wall. It shattered loudly. I was tired of being poor, Victor shouted. Tired of watching rich men get richer while we risked our lives for pennies. The gang watched silently. Jake stepped closer. And now you scare towns and steal from innocent people, he said. Victor drew his revolver in a flash. The room exploded into motion. Bang! Jake dove behind a table as bullets ripped through the saloon walls. Chairs flipped, bottles shattered, and smoke filled the air. Jake rolled across the floor and fired twice. 2 outlaws crashed to the ground. Another man aimed from the staircase. Jake shot the lantern above him. Darkness swallowed half the room. Gunfire echoed wildly. Victor's voice shouted from somewhere in the smoke. Get him! Jake kicked open the back door and stepped into the cold night air. He mounted his horse quickly. The fight had only begun. Behind him, the Black Vipers rushed out of the saloon. Victor Kane stepped into the street and pointed his gun at Jake. This ends tonight, Victor shouted. Jake looked back at his old friend. Yes, he said quietly, it does. Jake spurred his horse forward, racing out of Dusty Creek under the pale glow of the moon. Behind him, the thunder of hooves echoed through the quiet desert night. The Black Vipers were coming. Victor Kane rode at the front of the gang, his dark coat whipping in the wind as he shouted orders. "Don't let him escape!" Jake knew the land better than they did. Years ago, he had worked cattle across these same deserts and rocky hills. If he could reach Devil's Pass, the narrow canyon ahead, he might stand a chance. The trail twisted through dry brush and jagged stones. Jake leaned low over his horse's neck as bullets whistled past him in the darkness. Bang! A rock exploded beside him, showering sparks into the air. Jake didn't slow down. The entrance to Devil's Pass soon appeared, a narrow canyon carved deep between towering cliffs. The path inside was tight and dangerous, barely wide enough for two riders. Jake rode straight into it. Behind him, Victor and the gang followed without hesitation. Inside the canyon, the wind howled like a restless spirit. The cliffs rose high on both sides, blocking the moonlight and casting long shadows across the rocky trail. Jake pulled his horse to a sudden stop near a pile of loose stones. He quickly slid off the saddle and grabbed a rope tied behind it. With fast movements, he wrapped the rope around a large boulder resting near the edge of the cliff. Then he climbed a few feet up the rocks and cut the rope with his knife. The boulder shifted. For a second, nothing happened. Then gravity took over. The massive rock crashed down the slope, smashing into other stones and sending them tumbling into the narrow path. Crash! Boom! A wall of rock thundered into the canyon just as the Black Vipers rode in. Two horses reared in panic as the stones slammed into the ground. Dust filled the air. The gang scattered, shouting in confusion. Jake fired from the shadows. Bang! Bang! Two more outlaws fell. Victor ducked behind a rock, his face filled with rage. "You always were tricky," he shouted. Jake stepped out from the darkness, revolver in hand. Now only 3 of the Black Vipers remained. The canyon was quiet again except for the wind. Victor slowly stood up. It was time for the final fight.
The night slowly faded as the first light of dawn touched the cliffs of Devil's Pass. A cold wind moved through the canyon, carrying dust across the rocky ground. Jake Lawson stood near the fallen stones, his revolver steady in his hand. Across from him stood Victor Kane and the last 2 members of the Black Vipers. The outlaws looked nervous. The long chase and the gunfight had broken their confidence. Victor glanced at them and spoke quietly. "Leave," the 2 men hesitated. "Go!" Victor barked. Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving their leader alone. Now it was just Jake and Victor, just like the old days. For a moment, neither man spoke. The rising sun painted the canyon walls orange and gold. Victor slowly removed his hat and tossed it onto the ground. "Funny, isn't it?" he said. "After everything, it ends with just us." Jake nodded slightly. "It always was heading this way." Victor sighed. "We could have ruled this frontier together," he said. "No bosses, no rules." Jake shook his head. "That's not the life I wanted." Victor drew his revolver halfway from its holster. "You always did believe in right and wrong." Jake's voice stayed calm. "Someone has to." The wind fell silent. Both men stood still. The moment stretched longer and longer. Then, draw! 2 guns flashed in the rising sunlight. Bang! Victor staggered backward. His revolver slipped from his hand and hit the ground. Jake slowly lowered his weapon. Victor fell to his knees, then onto the dusty canyon floor. Jake walked closer. Victor looked up at him, breathing weakly. "Guess, you were always faster," he whispered. Jake knelt beside him. "I never wanted it to end like this," Jake said quietly. Victor gave a faint smile. "Me neither." A few seconds later, his eyes closed. The wind returned, whispering through the canyon. Jake stood up slowly and looked toward the rising sun. The Black Vipers were gone. Dusty Creek would be free again. Jake mounted his horse and rode toward the horizon. Another town saved, another story for the Wild West. And somewhere beyond the endless desert trails, a lone cowboy continued his ride.